All right, welcome back. This is going to be the second part of our Chapter 3 notes on society and culture in colonial America. I hope you had a great long Labor Day weekend. Remember, quiz on Wednesday, or Thursday rather, and the packet for Chapter 3 is also going to be due on Thursday. So we'll get right to it. So the first thing I want you to look at is this map a little bit, because it's an important thing for the future of the colonies to kind of see who's settling where. All the purple kind of represents British people and where they are. So it's important to note that the British are definitely the most influential people in the region, in the colonies. So they're going to have the greatest deal of influence. Next, you see probably the next most common would be people of Scotch-Irish descent, which you kind of see here and here and in western Pennsylvania. Note that those people are more kind of pushed or more kind of out away from the coastal areas and stuff like that, away from sources of water like rivers. This has a lot to do with their social status. People of Scotch-Irish descent are poor people, people with fewer means, and therefore they're going to settle in regions that are further away from these coastal areas where they're going to be able to trade more and generate more wealth. So it's basically a regular social construct that we see in general society. People with means and finances are going to be in the better places, right? So next you see the Germans. There's good German influence in the Virginia, Maryland area. So not a ton of Germans yet. We'll start getting a lot of Germans in the 1830s, and they're going to kind of be in Ohio and places west. You also have the Dutch that are pretty much just around New York here, the ones that stay behind after England takes over New York. And then, of course, the slave populations along the coast in the expected slave states. Notice also these population pockets that exist here are always near bodies of water, near rivers, because, that's the main mode of transportation and the means of trade back then. So people that are closer to river areas are going to have more ability to move around, to travel, and to build, their own wealth or opportunity. So moving on. So let's talk about law and politics in the colonies. Not super different from Britain. Remember, these people get their basis for law from the British system of government. But there are some important things to note here. For one, the colonial legislatures are very, very powerful. Each colony establishes its own legislature, and really they have very little oversight from the British. So colonial legislators essentially can make their own laws without the British really interfering, and can do these things without the consent of the British. Now, of course, their power technically comes from Britain, but the British don't really interfere much with what's going on in the colonies. Britain is worried about Britain and what's going on in there specifically. So as each successive generation passes, there's more freedoms being enjoyed by these colonial leaders and legislatures in establishing their own laws and rules and expectations in society. In fact, we have a name for this era. From 1607 to 1750, it's called the period of salutary neglect. That's a very important term. It's not quite a super important AP term, but I will put it on there anyway. So super important AP term, I believe number 5 is salutary neglect. Remember, these are things I've seen multiple times on AP exams. So salutary neglect is basically the British policy that existed from 1607 to 1750 to allow the colonies to govern themselves so they can make more money, and essentially the crown could come in and institute rules whenever they wanted to. The thing was, between 1607 and 1750, the crown did this very little. They essentially let the colonies govern themselves. They saw no problem with that. They thought that they have capable people there that are kind of running the colonies. So that's a really important concept that allows the colonies to grow a little bit and develop their own identity. And that's a really key point here, identity, because it's an identity of their own that's going to lead to the American Revolution. That's going to lead to the colonies establishing themselves and quickly being able to govern themselves by the time the revolution comes around. Why? Because they have been governing themselves for a long time. These colonial legislatures make their own laws. They get their own power essentially from the crown, but the crown isn't really doing anything. So where do you get it from there? It's the landowners, people with wealth and influence. These people are the ones that make the laws for the colonies, okay? This is really, really important for the coming revolution because they have these freedoms and ability to make their own laws. When you try to take that away from them, they're not going to like it. After 1750, when the British got more involved in the colonies weren't having it. They weren't interested in that. They say, we're doing fine here. We've been running ourselves now for, over a century. Why now all of a sudden, Britain, are you trying to interfere in our system of government? Okay? So essentially, in many ways, it's this concept of salutary neglect that leads to the American Revolution. Because had the British been on top of the colonies more, governing them more specifically, instituting rules and policies for all colonies to follow rather than letting individual colonies do their own thing, the concept of rule from Britain would have been something that seemed so foreign to the colonists, and they may not have rebelled. So I really want you to understand how important that is. Salutary neglect allows for the colonies to familiarize themselves with self-rule, and when you try to take that away from them, they're going to rebel, right? It's like any freedom. We have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom, all the things in the Constitution, okay? If that were to be taken away from people, there would be rebellion, right? You have certain rights as a 16-year-old. If that was suddenly taken away from you, those, say to drive your car, if that was taken away from you without cause, you would be upset. So consider kind of the position that the colonists are in, okay? They're used to governing themselves. They're used to doing their own thing. And then Britain comes in and says, no, you're not going to do that anymore. This is why, ultimately, we have revolution, okay? We'll take a look kind of to break down the colonies a little bit more, okay? So how do they break down over time? And this is, probably around, again, 1730-ish and, on until the revolution. So how do these two, a proprietary colony and a crown colony, differ? The governor of a proprietary colony, you don't have to write all this down, I just want you to kind of understand this, is appointed by the proprietor, but is paid by the citizens of the colony. So the people that live in the colony pay for the governor. No different than in any state today. The governor can veto legislation. The governor appoints members of the council. The governor can be overridden by English Parliament, but usually is not. Salutary neglect. Their council is basically a two-chamber council. This is in a typical colony. They have a House of Burgesses, a lower chamber, and an upper chamber, which is a council of the senior leaders, similar to House of Representatives and Senate. Okay? Who elects the members of the lower house? Landowning white males. That's how things are going to be in the United States at first once the U.S. is established. This House of Burgesses has the power to levy taxes, and all these taxes are based on land. Their power does influence a little bit over the governor, but it depends on the governor and their willingness to work with the House of Burgesses. The upper council is basically chosen from the most notable people, basically wealthy landowners in the colony, determine who's a member of this upper chamber or this council. Okay, so you should see a lot of similarities with our system of government today. Again, really important, salutary neglect allows us to establish a system of government. So when it comes time for us to really establish a system of government, we're already used to it, and it's a simple change. Okay. By contrast, there's only a couple things different in a royal colony. Okay. The governor, for instance, is not appointed by the citizens of the colony, but is appointed or by the proprietor, but is instead appointed by the king. But the citizens of the colony pay for him or her, but pretty much always him. Same power, veto local legislation. Same power appoints members of council, and again can be overridden by the parliament, but usually is not. Again, salutary neglect. Same thing here, council, upper chamber. Same thing here, House of Burgesses. Same things here, landowning white males can levy taxes, the House of Burgesses can use the power to control the governor, rarely happens, and again chosen by most notable citizens of the colony. So what's happening over time is we're seeing the systems of government within the colonies kind of coalesce a little bit and become very similar to one another. Again, really important for the ultimate establishment of the United States of America. Okay, so we're going to shift just a little bit here, talk about religious movements and things such as that. Okay, so one thing we're going to talk about here is the Great Awakening. This was a movement, because there's two of them, so people get confused. The first one happens that we're talking about now in the 1730s, roughly. Second one is about a century later, a little bit less than a century. So 1730s. The most prominent leader of the Great Awakening is a guy named Jonathan Edwards. That's him there. More on him in a moment. So, Puritanism is still a religion that's defining itself. Okay, it's very similar to Protestantism today, but if you know anything about Protestantism, there's still many different denominations of sects within Protestantism. One that becomes very popular in the colonies are Baptists and Methodists. Basically, we saw with Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson, there's people that don't always agree with the concept of John Winthrop's shining city upon a hill. So you get groups that break off of this Puritan ideology and follow, similar ideas, but with subtle or sometimes major differences. Baptists, for instance, believe in baptism not until you're an adult, because that's when somebody reaches a stage of maturity and adulthood. That's when their baptism should occur. Methodists are people that believe in more equality in terms of religion and things of that nature. They would be the first Puritan denomination or Protestant denomination to allow women preachers, and so you see that idea play off in the concept of religious freedom. Remember, that's something really a foundational idea in the United States of America, religious freedom. Okay, as time goes on, by the 1730s, the Puritans have been there over 100 years. Okay, people have new and different ideas, and they're breaking off into their little groups, and many others would come afterwards, in which they practice things a little bit differently and support concepts of religious freedom. How does this happen? Well, a big key to that is going to be the influence of really great preaching. Okay, Jonathan Edwards, for instance, was a great preacher to pull people back into the church. These are people that get out there and, like when you watch your televangelists, your guys on TV that get all excited about the faith and all that stuff. We see this happen quite a bit when you get somebody like a Jonathan Edwards who's going to really encourage people to examine their faith in a new and different way. This happens because of a time period kind of going on at the same time in Europe known as the Enlightenment. Okay, the Enlightenment brings about a new way of thinking and a new way of looking at people's faith, or a new way of thinking about the world in general. And the Enlightenment makes its way into the way people approach their faith. Okay, so you get these excellent preachers and religious leaders that promote ideologies about religion and get people to think about it in a different way. These people are known as New Lights. Jonathan Edwards is an example of a New Light preacher. Jonathan Edwards is one example. Another guy by the name of George Whitefield. I'm sorry, that's so bad. These are really, really, really important people for the early history of the American colonies. New Light preachers are what we call revivalists. Okay, their New Light ideology is that salvation is going to be something that's available for all people. Okay, so the big idea of New Light preachers is they're revivalists. They want to draw people back to the faith, and they believe in salvation for everyone. Whereas Old Light preachers, kind of the old ideology was the ideology of predestination. These people are known as, oops, sorry, we'll get to that later. These people are known as traditionalists, and their belief is in predestination, that God has already determined for you whether or not you're going to make it to heaven. Okay, obviously, the more common idea nowadays that we see is more of a New Light ideology, and it's really born during this time through the power of great preaching and preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards again. Okay, there is also rampant anti-Catholicism that exists in the New England colonies. We're primarily talking about the New England colonies here, not so much religious influence in the southern slave colonies. Anti-Catholicism was basically a result of people not liking the Pope. They don't like the Pope. They, in fact, banned. They banned Catholic services in many colonies, and were considered illegal in a lot of these places. So Catholics that would be over in the colonies would actually have to go, pray and have services in secret. In fact, Maryland, which was the great dream of Lord Calvert, George Calvert, to establish a Catholic colony in the Americas, in 1791, the proprietary colony of Maryland was overthrown, and therefore weakening the position of Catholicism in the colonies even more. So Catholicism, not really all that influential quite at this point. Okay? Here's another thing that I have seen once or twice on an AP exam. It's not a super important point, but it's something you should be aware of, and it's not in the book. It's something called the halfway covenant. You see, during the Great Awakening period, people were more and more concerned about people becoming less religious, less pious, because it was so hard because of the strict rules about joining the church. It was really hard for a lot of people to get in. So this halfway covenant comes along, and it's a concept that would allow for the children of the unclean, or the children of unbaptized Puritans, to join the church. Okay, so it would allow for these people to join the church. And even though that their parents were not members themselves. Okay, this was a halfway covenant, as it was called. It was a way to get more people into the church, young people, because it was a really exclusive place. The piety of people was limited, and as much as these colonies are so focused on religious strength and all that stuff, they're really not very welcoming. So if you weren't part of the church from birth, you could never really get in. The halfway covenant gets people to hopefully become more pious and allows them to rejoin the church. Okay? Shows you, big idea here, shows you how much influence the church had over people in the New England colonies especially. Okay, so another thing that comes out of this is as time goes on and there's more concerns in Puritan New England about people being less pious and less religious, they decide they have to do something about it. Okay, and this is where we start to see the development of school systems in the colonies. Okay, basically, education is going to focus on religion, but it's going to lead to the establishment of the first public school systems in the colonies. And that's going to be really important for the future, as in many other parts of the world, many other parts of civilized Europe, there's not, at this time, in the 1600s, 1700s, there's not really any, there's not real systems of public education. We're seeing in the colonies now the establishment of required public education. Now, it's very different than public education today because it's mostly focused on religion, and obviously we don't get that nowadays, but we see that system develop for the first time. Again, causation. How do we have an elaborate system of education in the United States? Because it's created early on and then over time gets established around, around the country. Okay. The other big outcome is that we first start to see colleges developed. In fact, Ivy League schools such as Harvard, for instance, when Harvard was first when Harvard was first opened, it was actually meant to be a school to teach young men to be preachers, okay, to be preachers or ministers. So even the Ivy League and famous and oldest colleges in the United States have their basis in these religious ideologies. Okay, I think that's all for this one. Sorry if it was a little choppy. If you have any questions about any of the stuff we talked about today, certainly email me, and I'll be glad to clarify anything you need to know.